again in that hymn, I could see Vladimir Putin's facial features across the screen. And don't forget, the Ukrainians are actually a very religious people with their Ukrainian Orthodox Church. And Putin wants them to be Russian Orthodox, not Ukrainian Orthodox. That's what that's about. There's a saying from the early Reformation. The egg that Erasmus laid was hatched by Luther. The egg that Erasmus laid was hatched by Luther. And the problem is Luther was actually quite an angry, violent man, whereas Erasmus was a quiet man. And maybe if Erasmus had led the Reformation, it wouldn't have been such a bloody event. But what a great hatching it was. Lutheran churches were soon established in northern Germany, Denmark, Norway, Sweden, Finland and Iceland. But all this led to the worst war in European history before the Great War of 1914 to 1980. In Holland, that was the 30 Years' War. In Holland, the Dutch fought the Spanish overlords, all Catholic, for 80 years. Fortunately, they were able to negotiate a 12 years truce in the middle of that period. Both those wars were ended with the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Now, this is all a bit dramatic, I realise, but actually that's how our churches were formed, out of that period, the Reformation and those two massive wars. That's how they were formed. The Reformed churches, the Presbyterian, and the congregational churches in England. There were other significant reformers in Switzerland. The first one was Ulrich Zwingli, who was the religious leader in the city of Zurich, and that was probably the beginning of the Reformed and Presbyterian churches. Later on, a Huguenot scholar from Picardy in France, Jean Calvin in French, but known as John Calvin, had to flee the dreadful persecution of the Protestant Huguenots in France. Many Huguenots escaped to England and Holland, and many of those who went to Holland eventually moved with the Dutch East Indies Company to the Cape and therefore to South Africa. And hence the many French names among Afrikaners. I gather some of you met an Afrikaner pastor yesterday with the surname Duplessis. That's quite a common French name among Afrikaners, and there are many more. I think there's a New Zealand cricketer as well, de Grantham, who comes from South Africa. Anyway, Calvin fled to Geneva, and that is where the first really fully fledged Reformed church was formed. And he had links with the eventual great leader of the Church of Scotland, John Knox. I don't know how many of you know that John Knox for some time was a slave galley slave who had to help row the galleys for the French Navy. Anyway, when he escaped from that, he went to Geneva and he worked with Calvin. And just an aside, Barbara and I noticed in 1978 when we were in Geneva, we were walking down one of the main streets towards the church where John Calvin used to preach, a hall with the title John Knox Hall, which was rather nice, I thought. Knox is the one. The Church of England was already established in the Church of England. The Church of Scotland was already established in Scotland. But John Knox did have some problems with the ladies, and I don't mean that in a bad sense. He couldn't get on with Mary, Queen of Scots, and he couldn't get on with Queen Elizabeth I. And so he wrote a book with a wonderful title, The Monstrous Regiment of Women. And now we come to the actual structure of our churches. They are very democratic, as Greg just mentioned earlier on, very democratic. The Presbyterian, the Reformed, and the congregational church. And I was going to tell you what the word Presbyterian comes from. Who knows what it comes from? Anybody? Well, it comes from the Greek word used in the New Testament and used in that reading from Titus that we just had. It comes from the Greek word presbyteros, which means an older person, an elder. So a Presbyterian church is a church run by elders. And all three churches traditions that I'm referring to are very democratic. So elders in the Presbyterian and Reformed churches and deacons in the congregational churches, they're pretty much the same as the work that elders do, are chosen by vote at meetings of the congregation. They have to be approved by a congregational meeting. Teaching elders, which is what I used to be, a minister is a teaching elder, are also chosen by votes at a congregational meeting. So the whole congregation, or the majority of the congregation, has to say yes to the choice of minister. But that choice also has to be approved by the local presbytery, classis in Dutch. And from the presbyteries, elders and ministers are chosen to go to the annual General Assembly. So, very democratic, and I'm proud of that. I hope you will be too. Traditionally, and this is important too, there has been an emphasis on having scholarly ministers in our churches. In New Zealand, however, this has to some degree been undermined, and I'm very sad about that, by our current conservative leaders who managed to get in their opinion, liberal Knox Theological Hall closed down. It's closed completely. The library's still there, but that's about it. And so the theological training can now be done in the University of Otago in their religious studies department, but it's not the same as Knox Theological Hall was. And most of the students for the ministry seem to go to Henderson Slade Law College, which used to be the Bible Training Institute, or BTI for short. And I suspect that many new ministers these days, being trained in that fashion, are unlikely to have absorbed the Presbyterian ethos. Hopefully there will be exceptions, I'm sure there will be, but it doesn't look that good at the moment from what I've heard. Now, for many generations, women could train at Knox Hall in Dunedin to become deaconesses. Many did, and did wonderful work. But not until the 1960s could women be elders or ministers. Thankfully, that has changed. But the decision the Assembly made was a good one. All those women who had been ordained deaconesses, had been trained, could become ministers. And that's what happened. Our first women ministers, including the first woman minister, the Reverend Margaret Martin. Reed Martin. Yes, she was Margaret Reed, and then married a widow minister and became Reed Martin. My impression now is that in many congregations there are more women elders than there are men elders. I think that's right. I'm pretty sure it's right in this congregation. Back until the 1960s, you would have just had to stay in the pew and let the men run things, you know. So that's a big change. And contrary to our reading from Titus, that's happened. You did get the point from Titus, did you? The woman of an elder had to behave herself. Yeah. So I'll go on. Oh, Margaret Reed Martin, by the way, also became the first woman moderator of the Presbyterian General Assembly. All important parts of our history. Now, the other thing in our church that I would like to tell you about, you probably all know, the Maori Synod. which was started in Wakatani by a Scottish minister who moved there, the Reverend John Hoani Lawton. And that synod still exists, and its marae is at Otago Beach. It's a wonderful place to go and have a look at. And his main work was in the Uruwiras with the Tūhoi tribe and with other Maori tribes. So that's how we got the Maori Synod there. It's now called Te Aka Puaho. Anyone know what that means? The glowing vine. Nice name. Te Aka Puaho. Now, one other thing that I've missed out, and I've only just realised it, there is still another synod in the South Island, the Synod of Otago and Southland. There were Presbyterian churches in the North Island, in the north of the South Island, but when the massive Scottish Free Church people settled in Otago and Southland, they set up their own synod. So at that point, there were two Presbyterian churches, the one main Presbyterian Church of New Zealand and the Presbyterian Church of Otago and Southland. And I think in about early 1900s, the two churches merged and became the one Presbyterian Church of New Zealand. So that's probably not news to most of you, but some of you may not have known that. It's mainly become a body that controls finances and properties for the Presbyterian churches in the South Island. I don't know what's happened to the APW, the Association of Presbyterian Women. They used to do wonderful work in the church also when I was a younger minister over the years, but I haven't heard about them. Does anyone here belong to the APW, if it's still around?
I think they've got a Facebook page, and this year they've joined with the Methodists to work with women in the Pacific. Oh,
that's great. Yeah. They've got a Facebook page and they've joined with the Methodists. So, yeah, Association of Presbyterian and Methodists. Great, thank you very much. And what about the very lively Presbyterian Bible class movement that we used to have and was so active over the whole country? Again, still when I was a younger minister for many years. That doesn't seem to happen anymore either. Anybody got any information on that? No. Okay, well, now we get on to what I've labelled as last but not least. But this is a high quality addition to our church. The many congregational church Pacific Islanders, the result of the Congregational London Missionary Society over the years, those who migrated to New Zealand from Samoa, Nua, the Cook Islands, Tokelau, and probably many other islands, have enriched, not necessarily financially, but in terms of membership in the church, the Presbyterian Church of New Zealand. And I want to pay tribute to that move. The Congregational Union was struggling a bit, and in 1969 they decided to join the Presbyterian Church of Aotearoa, New Zealand, and brought all our Pacific Island members into fellowship with our church. And they've certainly brought more life and faith into our denomination. Well, that's about all I've got to say today. I may have missed something. For example, Lloyd Deering. Does that ring a bell? Next week I'll be talking a bit about Lloyd. But the other people, well, Margaret Reed also, I want to talk a bit more about. She did a lot of work. She was leader of the Christian Education Commission when the National Council of Churches was still in place. And I did work with her in the same office in Auckland 20, 30 years ago. And the other one is Dr. Alan Brash. Perhaps I shouldn't say so, but he is the father of Dr. Don Brash. And he was an interesting character. He was head of the National Council of Churches for the New Zealand National Council of Churches for some time. Then he became the key person in the Christian Conference of Asia, Presbyterian minister. And then he went to Geneva and had a significant position in the World Council of Churches, which is still down there. I was wondering if it still existed, but it is still there in Geneva. And one of his special roles was to keep contact with the churches in the communist countries of Eastern Europe and Russia. And so he visited them there quite frequently. When he became moderator of the assembly, he had his black gown on, and in the front of the black gown, a rather large cross, which when I asked him, he said that was a gift to him from the Romanian Orthodox Church. So, quite ecumenical. Anyway, are there any questions at this point? Okay. Next Sunday, I'll be talking about what our churches believed in the past and what they, hopefully, what they believe now. That's next Sunday. Thank you.
Absolutely. It's always hard to know whether we can applaud in church, but we absolutely can. And I can assure you that Rinny has put so much preparation into these talks, as was evident today. And so a round of applause is absolutely deserved and appropriate.